2. 2 weeks after Stoner received his Bachelor of Arts degree, Archduke Francis Ferdinand was assassinated at Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist, and before autumn war was general all over Europe. It was a topic of continuing interest among the older students. They wondered about the part America would eventually play, and they were pleasantly unsure of their own futures. But before William Stoner, the future lay bright and certain and unchanging. He saw it not as a flux of event and change and potentiality, but as a territory ahead that awaited his exploration. He saw it as the great university library to which new wings might be built, to which new books might be added, and from which old ones might be withdrawn, while its true nature remained essentially unchanged. He saw the future in the institution to which he had committed himself, and which he so imperfectly understood. He conceived himself changing in that future, but he saw the future itself as the instrument of change rather than its object. Near the end of that summer, just before the beginning of the autumn semester, he visited his parents. He had intended to help with the summer crop, but he found that his father had hired a Negro field hand who worked with a quiet, fierce intensity, accomplishing by himself in a day nearly as much as William and his father together had once done in the same time. His parents were happy to see him, and they seemed not to resent his decision. But he found that he had nothing to say to them. Already he realized he and his parents were becoming strangers, and he felt his love increased by its loss. He returned to Columbia a week earlier than he had intended. He began to resent the time he had to spend at work on the Foot farm. Having come to his studies late, he felt the urgency of study. Sometimes, immersed in his books, there would come to him the awareness of all that he did not know, of all that he had not read, and the serenity for which he labored was shattered as he realized the little time he had in life to read so much, to learn what he had to know. He finished his coursework for the Master of Arts degree in the spring of 1915 and spent the summer completing his thesis, a prosodic study of one of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Before the summer was out, the Foots told him that they would not need him any longer on the farm. He had expected his dismissal, and in some ways he welcomed it, but for a moment after it happened he had a twinge of panic. It was as if the last tie between himself and the old life had been cut. He spent the last weeks of the summer at his father's farm, putting the finishing touches on his thesis. By that time, Archer Sloan had arranged for him to teach 2 classes of beginning English to incoming freshmen, while he started to work toward his PhD. For this, he received $400 a year. He removed his belongings from the Foots' tiny attic room, which he had occupied for 5 years, and took an even smaller room near the university. Though he was to teach only the fundamentals of grammar and composition to a group of unselected freshmen, he looked forward to his task with enthusiasm and with a strong sense of its significance. He planned the course during the week before the opening of the autumn semester, and saw the kinds of possibility that one sees as one struggles with the materials and subjects of an endeavor. He felt the logic of grammar, and he thought he perceived how it spread out from itself, permeating the language and supporting human thought. In the simple compositional exercises he made for his students, he saw the potentialities of prose and its beauties, and he looked forward to animating his students with the sense of what he perceived. But in the first classes he met, after the opening routines of roles and study plans, when he began to address himself to his subject and his students, he found that his sense of wonder remained hidden within him. Sometimes, as he spoke to his students, it was as if he stood outside himself and observed a stranger speaking to a group assembled unwillingly. He heard his own flat voice reciting the materials he had prepared, and nothing of his own excitement came through that recitation. He found his release and fulfillment in the classes in which he himself was a student. There he was able to recapture the sense of discovery he had felt on that first day, when Archer Sloan had spoken to him in class, and he had, in an instant, become someone other than who he had been. As his mind engaged itself with its subject, as it grappled with the power of the literature he studied and tried to understand its nature, he was aware of a constant change within himself, and as he was aware of that, he moved outward from himself into the world which contained him, so that he knew that the poem of Milton's that he read, or the essay of Bacon's, or the drama of Ben Jonson's, changed the world which was its subject, and changed it because of its dependence upon it. He seldom spoke in class, and his papers rarely satisfied him. Like his lectures to his young students, they did not betray what he most profoundly knew. He began to be on familiar terms with a few of his fellow students who were also acting instructors in the department. Among those were two with whom he became friendly, David Masters and Gordon Finch. Masters was a slight, dark youth with a sharp tongue and gentle eyes. Like Stoner, he was just beginning his doctoral program, though he was a year or so younger than Stoner. Among the faculty and the graduate students, he had a reputation for arrogance and impertinence, and it was generally conceded that he would have some difficulty in finally obtaining his degree. Stoner thought him the most brilliant man he had ever known, and deferred to him without envy or resentment. Gordon Finch was large and blond, and already, at the age of 23, beginning to run to fat. He had taken an undergraduate degree from a commercial college in St. Louis, and at the university had made various stabs at advanced degrees in the departments of economics, history, and engineering. He had begun work on his degree in literature, largely because he had been able, at the last minute, to get a small instructing job in the English department. He quickly showed himself to be the most nearly indifferent student in the department, but he was popular with the freshmen, and he got along well with the older faculty members and with the officers of the administration. The three of them, Stoner, Masters, and Finch, got in the habit of meeting on Friday afternoons at a small saloon in downtown Columbia, drinking large schooners of beer and talking late into the night. Though he found the only social pleasure he knew in these evenings, Stoner often wondered at their relationship. Though they got along well enough together, they had not become close friends. They had no confidences and seldom saw each other outside their weekly gatherings. None of them ever raised the question of that relationship. Stoner knew that it had not occurred to Gordon Finch, but he suspected that it had to David Masters. Once, late in the evening, as they sat at a rear table in the dimness of the saloon, Stoner and Masters talked of their teaching and study with the awkward facetiousness of the very serious. Masters, holding aloft a hard-boiled egg from the free lunch as if it were a crystal ball, said, "Have you gentlemen ever considered the question of the true nature of the university?" Mr. Stoner? Mr. Finch? Smiling, they shook their heads. "I'll bet you haven't. Stoner here, I imagine, sees it as a great repository, like a library or a whorehouse, where men come of their free will and select that which will complete them, where all work together like little bees in a common hive. The true, the good, the beautiful. They're just around the corner, in the next corridor. They're in the next book, the one you haven't read, or in the next stack, the one you haven't got to. But you'll get to it someday, and when you do, he looked at the egg for a moment more, then took a large bite of it and turned to Stoner, his jaws working and his dark eyes bright. Stoner smiled uncomfortably, and Finch laughed aloud and slapped the table. "He's got you, Bill. He's got you good." Masters chewed for a moment more, swallowed, and turned his gaze to Finch. "And you, Finch, what's your idea?" He held up his hand. "You'll protest you haven't thought of it, but you have. Beneath that bluff and hearty exterior there works a simple mind. To you, the institution is an instrument of good. To the world at large, of course, and just incidentally to yourself. You see it as a kind of spiritual sulfur and molasses that you administer every fall to get the little bastards through another winter. And you're the kindly old doctor who benignly pats their heads and pockets their fees." Finch laughed again and shook his head. "I swear, Dave, when you get going—" Masters put the rest of the egg in his mouth, chewed contentedly for a moment, and took a long swallow of beer. "But you're both wrong," he said. "It is an asylum, or what do they call them now? A rest home for the infirm, the aged, the discontent, and the otherwise incompetent. Look at the three of us. We are the university. The stranger would not know that we have so much in common, but we know, don't we? We know well." Finch was laughing. "What's that, Dave?" Interested now in what he was saying, Masters leaned intently across the table. Let's take you first, Finch. Being as kind as I can, I would say that you are the incompetent. As you yourself know, you're not really very bright, though that doesn't have everything to do with it. Here now, Finch said, still laughing. But you're bright enough, and just bright enough, to realize what would happen to you in the world. You're cut out for failure, and you know it. Though you're capable of being a son of a bitch, you're not quite ruthless enough to be so consistently. Though you're not precisely the most honest man I've ever known, neither are you heroically dishonest. On the one hand, you're capable of work, but you're just lazy enough so that you can't work as hard as the world would want you to. On the other hand, you're not quite so lazy that you can impress upon the world a sense of your importance. And you're not lucky, not really. No aura rises from you, and you wear a puzzled expression. In the world, you would always be on the fringe of success, and you would be destroyed by your failure. So you were chosen, elected. Providence, whose sense of humor has always amused me, has snatched you from the jaws of the world and placed you safely here, among your brothers. Still smiling and ironically malevolent, he turned to Stoner. Nor do you escape, my friend. No, indeed. Who are you? A simple son of the soil, as you pretend to yourself? Oh, no. You, too, are among the infirm. You are the dreamer, the madman in a madder world. Our own Midwestern Don Quixote without his Sancho, gambling under the blue sky. You're bright enough, brighter anyhow than our mutual friend, but you have the taint, the old infirmity. You think there's something here, something to find. Well, in the world, you'd learn soon enough. You too are cut out for failure. Not that you'd fight the world. You'd let it chew you up and spit you out, and you'd lie there wondering what was wrong. Because you'd always expect the world to be something it wasn't, something it had no wish to be. The weevil in the cotton, the worm in the beanstalk, the borer in the corn. You couldn't face them, and you couldn't fight them. Because you're too weak, and you're too strong. And you have no place to go in the world. What about you? Finch asked. What about yourself? Oh, Master said, leaning back. I'm one of you. Worse, in fact. I'm too bright for the world, and I won't keep my mouth shut about it. It's a disease for which there is no cure. So I must be locked up, where I can be safely irresponsible, where I can do no harm. He leaned forward again and smiled at them. We're all poor Toms, and we're cold. King Lear, Stoner said, seriously. Act 3, Scene 4, said Masters. And so Providence, or society, or fate, or whatever name you want to give it, has created this hovel for us, so that we can go in out of the storm. It's for us that the university exists, for the dispossessed of the world, not for the students, not for the selfless pursuit of knowledge, nor for any of the reasons that you hear. We give out the reasons, and we let a few of the ordinary ones in, those that would do in the world, but that's just protective coloration. Like the church in the Middle Ages, which didn't give a damn about the laity or even about God. We have our pretenses in order to survive, and we shall survive because we have to. Finch shook his head admiringly. You sure make us sound bad, Dave. Maybe I do, Masters said. But bad as we are, we're better than those on the outside, in the muck, the poor bastards of the world. We do no harm, we say what we want, and we get paid for it. And that's a triumph of natural virtue, or pretty damn close to it. Masters leaned back from the table, indifferent, no longer concerned with what he had said. Gordon Finch cleared his throat. Well now, he said earnestly, you may have something in what you say, Dave, but I think you go too far, I really do. Stoner and Masters smiled at each other, and they spoke no more of the question that evening. But for years afterward, at odd moments, Stoner remembered what Masters had said, and though it brought him no vision of the university to which he had committed himself, it did reveal to him something about his relationship to the two men, and it gave him a glimpse of the corrosive and unspoiled bitterness of youth. On May 7th, 1915, a German submarine sank the British liner Lusitania with 114 American passengers on board. By the end of 1916, submarine warfare by the Germans was unrestricted, and relations between the United States and Germany steadily worsened. In February 1917, President Wilson broke off diplomatic relations. On April 6th, a state of war was declared by Congress to exist between Germany and the United States. With that declaration, thousands of young men across the nation, as if relieved that the tension of uncertainty had finally been broken, besieged the recruiting stations that had been hastily set up some weeks before. Indeed, hundreds of young men had not been able to wait for America's intervention and had, as early as 1915, signed up for duty with the Royal Canadian Forces or as ambulance drivers for one of the European Allied armies. A few of the older students at the university had done so. And although William Stoner had not known any of these, he heard their legendary names with increasing frequency as the months and weeks drew on to the moment that they all knew must eventually come. War was declared on a Friday, and although classes remained scheduled the following week, few students or professors made a pretense of meeting them. They milled about in the halls and gathered in small groups, murmuring in hushed voices. Occasionally, the tense quietness erupted into near violence. Twice, there were general anti-German demonstrations in which students shouted incoherently and waved American flags. Once there was a brief-lived demonstration against one of the professors, an old and bearded teacher of Germanic languages who had been born in Munich and who, as a youth, had attended the University of Berlin. But when the professor met the angry and flushed little group of students, blinked in bewilderment, and held out his thin, shaking hands to them, they disbanded in sullen confusion. During those first days after the declaration of war, Stoner also suffered a confusion, but it was profoundly different from that which gripped most of the others on the campus. Though he had talked about the war in Europe with the older students and instructors, he had never quite believed in it, and now that it was upon him, upon them all, he discovered within himself a vast reserve of indifference. He resented the disruption which the war forced upon the university, but he could find in himself no very strong feelings of patriotism, and he could not bring himself to hate the Germans. But the Germans were there to be hated. Once Stoner came upon Gordon Finch talking to a group of older faculty members. Finch's face was twisted, and he was speaking of the Huns as if he was spitting on the floor. Later, when he approached Stoner in the large office, which half a dozen of the younger instructors shared, Finch's mood had shifted. Feverishly jovial, he clapped Stoner on the shoulder. "Can't let them get away with it, Bill," he said rapidly. A film of sweat like oil glistened on his round face, and his thin blonde hair lay in lank strands over his skull. "No, sir. I'm going to join up. I've already talked to old Sloan about it, and he said to go ahead. I'm going down to St. Louis tomorrow and sign up." For an instant he managed to compose his features into a semblance of gravity. "We've all got to do our part." Then he grinned and clapped Stoner's shoulder again. "You better come along with me." "Me?" Stoner said, and said again incredulously, "Me?" Finch laughed. "Sure. Everybody's signing up. I just talked to Dave. He's coming with me." Stoner shook his head as if dazed. "Dave Masters?" "Sure. Old Dave talks kind of funny sometimes, but when the chips are down, he's no different from anybody else. He'll do his part. Just like you'll do yours, Bill." Finch punched him on the arm. "Just like you'll do yours." Stoner was silent for a moment. "I hadn't thought about it," he said. "It all seems to have happened so quickly. I'll have to talk to Sloan. I'll let you know." "Sure," Finch said. "You'll do your part." His voice thickened with feeling. "We're all in this together now, Bill. We're all in it together." Stoner left Finch then, but he did not go to see Archer Sloan. Instead, he looked about the campus and inquired after David Masters. He found him in one of the library carrels, alone. puffing on a pipe and staring at a shelf of books. Stoner sat across from him at the Carroll desk. When he questioned him about his decision to join the army, Masters said, "Sure, why not?" And when Stoner asked him why, Masters said, "You know me pretty well, Bill. I don't give a damn about the Germans. When it comes down to it, I don't really give a damn about the Americans either, I guess." He knocked his pipe ashes out on the floor and swept them around with his foot. "I suppose I'm doing it because it doesn't matter whether I do it or not. And it might be amusing to pass through the world once more before I return to the cloistered and slow extinction that awaits us all." Though he did not understand, Stoner nodded, accepting what Masters told him. He said, "Gordon wants me to enlist with you." Masters smiled. "Gordon feels the first strength of virtue he's ever been allowed to feel, and he naturally wants to include the rest of the world in it, so that he can keep on believing. Sure, why not? Join up with us. It might do you good to see what the world's like." He paused and looked intently at Stoner. "But if you do, for Christ's sake, don't do it for God, country, and the dear old U of M. Do it for yourself." Stoner waited several moments. Then he said, "I'll talk to Sloan and let you know." He did not know what he expected Archer Sloan's response to be. Nevertheless, he was surprised when he confronted him in his narrow, book-lined office and told him of what was not quite yet his decision. Sloan, who had always maintained toward him an attitude of detached and courtly irony, lost his temper. His long, thin face went red, and the lines on either side of his mouth deepened in anger. He half rose from his chair toward Stoner, his fists clenched. Then he settled back and deliberately loosened his fists and spread his hands upon his desk. The fingers were trembling, but his voice was steady and harsh. "I ask you to forgive my sudden display, but in the last few days I have lost nearly a third of the members of the department, and I see no hope of replacing them. It is not you at whom I am angry, but—" He turned away from Stoner and looked up at the high window at the far end of his office. The light struck his face sharply, accentuating the lines and deepening the shadows under his eyes, so that for a moment he seemed old and sick. "I was born in 1860, just before the War of the Rebellion. I don't remember it, of course. I was too young. I don't remember my father either. He was killed in the first year of the war, at the Battle of Shiloh." He looked quickly at Stoner. "But I can see what has ensued. A war doesn't merely kill off a few thousand or a few 100,000 young men. It kills off something in a people that can never be brought back. And if a people goes through enough wars, pretty soon all that's left is the brute, the creature that we, you and I and others like us, have brought up from the slime." He paused for a long moment. Then he smiled slightly. "The scholar should not be asked to destroy what he has aimed his life to build." Stoner cleared his throat and said diffidently, "Everything seems to have happened so quickly. Somehow it had never occurred to me until I talked to Finch and Masters. It still doesn't seem quite real." "It's not, of course," Sloan said. Then he moved restlessly, turning away from Stoner. "I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'll simply say this. It's your choice to make. There will be a conscription, but you can be expected if you want to be. You're not afraid to go, are you?" "No, sir," Stoner said. "I don't believe so." "Then you do have a choice, and you'll have to make it for yourself. It goes without saying that if you decide to join, you will, upon your return, be reinstated in your present position. If you decide not to join, you can stay on here, but of course you will have no particular advantage. It is possible that you will have a disadvantage, either now or in the future." "I understand," Stoner said. There was a long silence, and Stoner decided at last that Sloan had finished with him. But just as he got up to leave the office, Sloan spoke again. He said slowly, "You must remember what you are, and what you have chosen to become, and the significance of what you are doing. There are wars and defeats and victories of the human race that are not military and that are not recorded in the annals of history. Remember that while you're trying to decide what to do." For 2 days, Stoner did not meet his classes and did not speak to anyone he knew. He stayed in his small room, struggling with his decision. His books and the quiet of his room surrounded him. Only rarely was he aware of the world outside his room, of the far murmur of shouting students, of the swift clatter of a buggy on the brick streets, and the flat chug of one of the dozen or so automobiles in town. He had never got in the habit of introspection, and he found the task of searching his motives a difficult and slightly distasteful one. He felt that he had little to offer to himself, and that there was little within him which he could find. When at last he came to his decision, it seemed to him that he had known all along what it would be. He met Masters and Finch on Friday, and told them that he would not join them to fight the Germans. Gordon Finch, sustained still by his accession to virtue, stiffened and allowed an expression of reproachful sorrow to settle on his features. "You're letting us down, Bill," he said, thickly. "You're letting us all down." "Be quiet," Masters said. He looked keenly at Stoner. "I thought you might decide not to. You've always had that lean, dedicated look about you. It doesn't matter, of course, but what made you finally decide?" Stoner did not speak for a moment. He thought of the last 2 days, of the silent struggle that seemed toward no end and no meaning. He thought of his life at the university for the past 7 years. He thought of the years before, the distant years with his parents on the farm, and of the deadness from which he had been miraculously revived. "I don't know," he said at last. "Everything, I guess. I can't say." "It's going to be hard," Masters said, "staying here." "I know," Stoner said. "But it's worth it, you think?" Stoner nodded. Masters grinned and said with his old irony, "You have the lean and hungry look, sure enough. You're doomed." Finch's sorrowful reproach had turned into a kind of tentative contempt. "You'll live to regret this, Bill," he said hoarsely, and his voice hesitated between threat and pity. Stoner nodded. "It may be," he said. He told them goodbye then and turned away. They were to go to St. Louis the next day to enlist, and Stoner had classes to prepare for the following week. He felt no guilt for his decision, and when conscription became general, he applied for his deferment with no particular feeling of remorse. But he was aware of the looks that he received from his older colleagues and of the thin edge of disrespect that showed through his students' conventional behavior toward him. He even suspected that Archer Sloan, who had at one time expressed a warm approval of his decision to continue at the university, grew colder and more distant as the months of the war wore on. He finished the requirements for his doctorate in the spring of 1918 and took his degree in June of that year. A month before he received his degree, he got a letter from Gordon Finch, who had gone through officers' training school and had been assigned to a training camp just outside New York City. The letter informed him that Finch had been allowed, in his spare time, to attend Columbia University, where he, too, had managed to fulfill the requirements necessary for a doctorate, which he would take in the summer from Teachers College there. It also told him that Dave Masters had been sent to France, and that almost exactly a year after his enlistment, with the first American troops to see action, had been killed at Château Thierry.